Hello, new schoolers. Hope everybody's doing well out there. I'd like to go ahead and get another chess video under our belt. If you have not yet seen the first chess video that I released and you're new to the game, please go back and watch that so you can get a good grasp on how all the pieces move. Today we're going to start off with a few terms. I've got my chessboard set up here. But right off the bat, I want to talk about parts of the game, time frames of the game. Now, when the game's first starting out, we call that the opening. That's when all the pieces are in their original position. As you can see right now, they are not, because I want to show you guys something on the board here in a minute. But when all your chess pieces are at their starting positions, the opening would consist of those first few moves after that. A lot of times people will put their center pawns 2 spaces each as some of their first moves to start controlling that center of the board. The knights come out pretty quickly since they can jump over that front line of pawns. Getting the bishops involved, those things can all be involved in the opening of the game, which just refers to the first few moves of the game. Now after that is the middle game. That's the longest portion of the game usually. And that's when pieces have been developed, a lot of your back line has moved out. You probably have not connected your back rooks yet, by which I mean cleared the pieces out in between your back rooks so that they connect, which can be very useful for the end of the game. But the middle game is pretty much all of that chunk in the middle where you're positioning, you're capturing pieces, and you're trying to get an advantage by having more pawns than your opponent and more minor pieces than your opponent, and having your pieces in a better position. Now the end game is what we refer to as the very end of the game. Generally when there's when there's only a few pieces left on the board, oftentimes the rooks, if you still have both of them, will be connected because you've castled your king to one side or the other, and we'll talk about that today. But the end game really refers to that last little bit of the game. It can take a long time depending on how well you're positioned and how well your opponent is positioned, but it refers to those last few moves of the game, or that last section of the game where you're trying to get each other in checkmate. There's not very many pieces left on the board. So first, I want to talk about castling. Now, in this game that you can see that I've got set up here, white is over here, black is over here, and if you can see the king and the rook here, you'll notice that the king has come to the outside towards the corner of the board of the rook, which means at some point this player has castled, and to castle he would have to have his king in its original position and its rook in its original position. Neither of them can have moved yet. If you move either of the pieces that you're going to castle, and it can only be the king that castles with a rook, if you move either of those pieces ahead of time, then you cannot castle with those anymore. If you had your rook on the far side and you had not moved him yet, you could castle over here. But another prerequisite to castling is that there cannot be any pieces in between your king and your rook. So when you castle and you're ready, the king moves towards the corner 2 spaces. And then the rook from that corner comes just to his inside. Let's watch that again. The king is in his original position and has not moved yet. The rook that you're castling with is in his original position and has not moved yet. So the king moves 2 spaces towards the corner, and the rook comes just to his inside. And that just counts as 1 move. Even though you're using 2 pieces, castling is just 1 turn. So let's leave these pieces in their position where they're at. This is what we're going to look at when we go to a checkmate example here in a little bit. Let me see if I can get another good angle at the board, and I'll get you a better one here in a moment. So castling can be very important. It's good for protecting your king. It's really good to castle as early as possible in many cases. That way you get your king into a corner that you can protect more. As you can see in this game, he's got quite a bit of protection for his king. His king is sitting right here, protected by a rook on his outside, pawns in front, and then also pretty much right in front of him is his queen, his bishop, and his knight. All of these pieces are there to defend the king, and really he's only got 1 attacking piece out here, and then if you'll look way up here, he's got a pawn, and that pawn can be a big pain for somebody. If you get a pawn all the way across, that's what we're going to talk about next. When a pawn goes all the way to the other side of the board. If this queen were not here blocking him, let's see if we can get a better angle. See how the queen is lined up there? Let me show you black's positions just so we're clear on what's what. The queen is on the back line here. The king is actually directly next to the pawn of the white's pawn. And there's a bishop back in the corner that's blocked in by a pawn, and the king is actually only blocked in by the king because the bishop can't move forward. So he's got two pawns over here on the same line. The pawn here, and then he's got some other attacking pieces which are all kind of stuck in the corner. Obviously the rook hasn't moved out of its original position, and the knight has not yet moved out of its original position. The bishop is here on the corner along this long diagonal. This can be a good spot for a bishop. If you get them on the long diagonals, they cover a lot of ground. All right, so let's talk about that promotion, that pawn over there, who's almost all the way across. If this queen were not here, and the pawn were to get all the way across, then you would get another queen, or any other major piece, or you could turn it into a queen, you could turn it into a rook, a knight, or a bishop. But almost always, and for the sake of today's lesson, we'll say that you want to turn it into another queen. So to do that, you might just remember that that pawn is a queen, which can be hard to do. You could put a little penny or something under that pawn to note that it is not just a pawn, it is now a queen. But if it gets all the way to the other side of the board, you may turn your pawn into a queen. And that would be really bad for your opponent if they've got to face two of your queens. All right, so we're going to move on. We talked about castling and talked about promoting pawns. Next, I want to talk about check and checkmate, and that's why I've got this setup going on right here. Now, this is a setup where the only thing that needs to happen for white to get black in checkmate is one move. Now, let me show you the board again as well as I can. I'm going to go all the way around it. So here's from white's perspective. Here's from black's perspective. And I'm going to take you back and get you on a good angle here so that you can see the board more in 3 dimensions. There we go. Now the point that we're going to be checkmating is kind of an obvious one for more advanced chess players, but for the beginning players, it's really important to note some of the things that happen in this checkmate. We're going to take this queen here, who's going to come out along the black diagonal and sit right here in front of black's queen, or black's king there, I'm sorry. Now when he does this, he puts black in check because the queen is on a straight line aiming at the king. So the king has to move to get out of check. He has to either move and get out of check. He has to block it with another piece, put it in between, or he has to capture the queen. Now, none of the pieces that black has can currently capture the king. There's a pawn right next to the queen. I'm sorry. None of them can currently capture the white's queen. The pawn is right next to the queen, so he cannot attack diagonally as they do. The bishop and queen are stuck behind the king, so they can't get out in front to block. And he's got nowhere to go. He can't move towards the queen in any direction because she will still be checking him. He can't move backwards because the queen will still be checking him. So that is checkmate. The king is stuck, and you have yourself a checkmate from that one move. I'm going to hold the camera up here a little bit and do it again for you so you can get maybe a good angle on it. The queen was here, nestled back next to the king here, and the queen moved out along the black diagonal and ended right on the same line as the king. Now the king cannot move here, cannot move here, and cannot move here because all of those are in the queen's directional aim. Can also not move backwards into that empty space because this queen is still on that line. And there are no pieces of blacks that could come in and block and stop that check. So there you have a successful checkmate by white from a position that really isn't yet in the end game. Sometimes you can get these checkmates earlier than the end game when there's still a lot of pieces left on the board board if you're keeping an eye out for openings and little opportunities. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is I want to go through each piece again. I know last week we did how they move, how each piece moves, but this week I'm going to give you some hints for the opening, the middle game, and the end game for each piece. And I'll start with the king. So the king obviously moves one space at a time in any direction. Now, early on in the opening, you want to make sure that you're putting yourself in a position to protect your king. When it gets to the middle game, after the first few moves, you want to protect your king still, and also think about castling so you can get him into the corner. Think about the pieces that are in front of him and how to protect them. There are some weak points in the pawns right near the king that you want to keep your eye out for. So just always make sure during the middle game you're still protecting your king. Now, however, when it gets to the end game, if there's just a few pieces left, say you've got a few pawns and a king and a knight, and your opponent has pretty much the same amount of pieces, then you want to actually start using your king to attack. Move him out into that board, still keeping in mind that you need to make sure that he can't be put in check and that you can't start getting pushed around too much. But if you get your king out, oftentimes using your remaining pawns as blockers and tucking your king behind them as they all move together, then the king can become a very important and vital attacking piece. It can cut off an entire section of the board for the other king to move if you get him near their other king. So keep in mind that the king can be a very important attacking piece at the end of the game. Now next we're going to move to the queen. The queen, just as a refresher, can move in any direction at once, as far as at once, in a straight line. Now, the queen is your most valuable attacking piece. It's a big advantage to have the queen until the end of the game, and for as long as you can, you want to hold on to it. So early on in the opening, I generally don't like to take the queen out. Some people do. Some people like to get their queen involved early. To me, if I get my queen involved early, a lot of times they can end up attacking my queen and getting their pieces developed while I'm trying to protect her and move her out of those attacking lines. So I want to still be in the opening and in the early portions of the middle game. I want to be protecting this queen and using it sparingly if I can. Now, that doesn't mean to pass up an opportunity. As you saw in this checkmate, there was an opportunity to get that queen involved in the middle of the board and get a checkmate. If you ever see an opportunity for a checkmate, you want to take it and you want to be on the lookout for those opportunities too. Now, at the end game, the queen is really, really valuable. It's super mobile. It can move as far as it wants and check the king from multiple different angles, and oftentimes in consecutive turns. You can check him from one side, and when he moves, go completely to his other side and try and flank him and check him from that side, and really push the opponent's king around, especially if they do not still have their queen. Then the queen is a big, big, big advantage at the end of the game. So next we're going to move on to the bishops. The bishops move along the diagonals of squares as far as they want. One is always on white and one is always on black, and they never get off of their respective color squares. Now, the bishop in the early game is one of those that's relatively easy to involve. By just moving a pawn forward, you can generally get your bishops out into the game. So if you move those pawns that are blocking the bishop and get them out early into the game, they can start to put pressure on the middle with the pawns that you've moved out. They can start to angle in towards some attacking lanes towards the opponent's area, and then you just want to make sure that you're getting those involved early. Now, the bishops can be very valuable at the end of the game, especially if you still have both of them. If you still have both of your bishops, they are worth more than they are alone. Because one of them's on the white and one of them's always on the black diagonals, then those you can cut off you can make an entire wall from which their king cannot get past. As long as the pieces are allowing that straight aim towards the king there, you can block off two whole rows of diagonals that the king cannot cross. So at the end of the game, if you have both of your bishops, they can be very valuable using them in that way to get a check or a checkmate. Next, we're going to go on to the knight. The knight in the opening is one of the easiest pieces to get involved, like I said, because he can jump over the line. You'll use the knights to help support your pawns, which you've moved to the center. You can use them also to attack. Another good thing about knights is once you get past the opening into the middle game, they're really good as both attackers and defenders. As you see here on this example, the king has a pawn right in front of him and then a knight. Now this knight can be serving two purposes. He can serve as a blocker. If somebody comes in to check your king, he can move to the angles, which will cut off that check. He can also serve as an attacker at the same time. If he's here in the middle of the board, he's got a lot of access to a lot of different spaces, and he can jump over your pieces or the opponent's. So he can act as a really good attacker, especially if he's in the middle of the board. You want to make sure your knights are in the middle of the board. The bishops, not so much, because they can move a long distance. They're actually good to be on those long diagonals, but sometimes towards the corners they can be really effective. The knights, you want to try to keep them in towards the middle of the board, because if they're on the sides, it really limits how many spaces they can attack and cover. You're cutting off basically half of the available moves for the knight once you get them towards the edge. So you want to try and make sure your knights stay towards the center of the board. Obviously, sometimes there are always exceptions to these rules. I would say I have found some use occasionally for a knight on the edge of the board. If I have a specific attack that I have in mind and it requires some added pressure from any angle that I can get with, I'll put the knight out there on the edge. But I try to avoid it if I'm just developing my pieces. So as a little recap, that knight and the bishop are the best ones to get developed early. Now we're going to move on to... Oh wait, I wanted to talk about one more thing about knights in the end game. I want to talk to you about a concept called forking, like you eat with a fork. Now forking is when you are attacking or you're aiming at two different pieces at the same time. And it doesn't have to be a knight. Bishops and queens can do it. Rooks can do it. But knights can do it in a very sneaky way because they move in that funny L shape. They can be attacking two pieces which aren't on the same line. I can be attacking, say, putting his king in check at the same time that my knight is focused on an unguarded bishop here. Now, if I put him in check with my king, or with my knight, he's got to move out of check. So after he moves out of check, then I've still got my eye, or my aim from my knight on the bishop. And I can take his bishop for free. He never had the chance to move it. I got close. When I got close to the king, I put him in check. Or when I got close to his bishop, I was also putting him in check. And that left me the opportunity to then take his bishop after he moves out of check. I'll send a good example of that at some point. That's a really good tactic with the knight. You can use that in the middle game as well as the end game, but it becomes very effective in the end game if you can catch them putting their pieces in a position to let your knight attack both of them at the same time, especially if one's the king, because then he's got to move his king out of check and he cannot move the other piece out of harm's way. So we're going to move on to the rooks. The rooks are great for the end game. They're really hard to develop early in the opening. They're stuck in the corners. They can't get past the pawns, which are directly in front of them. And oftentimes you don't really want to move them yet anyway, so that you can keep available the opportunity to castle later on. Remember, castling can go to either side. No matter when you do it, that king comes over two spaces towards the rook, and then the rook that you're going towards comes just inside the king. Now, again, these pieces are really hard to develop early, but in the middle game, you want to start trying to get towards an area where you can castle, clearing the spaces out in between your king and your rooks, and then castling. Now, when you castle, if you still have both rooks, they're going to be connected. There's no space in between these two rooks here. These two rooks are connected now. A lot of times people would consider that to be the start of the endgame, when one or both players has connected their rooks so that they're both protecting each other, and oftentimes if they've castled, the king is also in that line, and they're serving as protection for him also. Now, when you get to the end game, these connected rooks can be really valuable for defense or for attack, and somewhat at the same time. Now, rooks need an open file. They need all the pawns clear between them and the opponent's pieces to really be active and useful as an attacker. So as you're getting towards the end game, you want to position your rooks where some of your pawns have already been captured out of that line, and especially somewhere where your pawns and the opponent's pawns have been captured along that same line towards the opponent. That's where they'll be most effective, and they'll be able to attack and defend this back line in the same way at the same time. Now, last but not least, certainly not least, we have pawns. Pawns serve an important function in all phases of the game. Early on in the opening, their best use is often to try and control the board, getting your pieces out into the middle as early as you can, getting those two pawns out into the middle of the board. You can protect them with your knights and bishops very easily. And then the pawns on the side here, you want to keep in mind which direction you're going to be castling towards, and don't get those pawns out too far. Sometimes I'll leave these pawns completely back so that I have the opportunity to castle towards either side, or at least try not to move them all out, because then it's really taking away that defensive advantage that you get from castling. Now, the pawns in the middle game, you want to basically create the landscape of your defense, because you're going to be putting your pawns out here in pawn chains, which are when they're linked diagonally so that they all help each other. This pawn, and this pawn are all defending one another, sort of. This pawn is the only one that's not defended because it's in the back, but that can be easily changed by moving a rook over, by getting the bishop back on that line to defend this pawn. But you want to be making sure that you're, in the middle game, really setting your pawns up so that your pieces can get out, but your king is still protected by them. So keep that in mind. Now in the end game, the pawn becomes really important because, as we said at the beginning of the video, it can be promoted into a queen. Now in the end game, when you just have a few pawns left and your opponent has the same, where your pawn's at and how easily they can get to the other side of that board is going to be the difference between winning the game and losing the game. If you can get your pawn on a path that is totally clear of other of the opponent's pawns and maybe even his other pieces, then you will have an advantage to get to the other side and get promoted. And when you have two queens, or even just an extra queen that you had lost before, then you will have a much greater chance of winning at the end of the game. I hope you found these tips helpful for your assignment for this week. When you have time, I'd like you to play a game and really remember all the tips I said about each piece. I'm going to go over those again real quick. The king, try and get him into an attacking position once you get to the end of the game. The queen, protect it as long as you can until you really need it to start attacking. The bishops can be really useful together, especially in the end game, if you have both of your bishops. The knights are really useful to get involved early, and at the end of the game, in the middle of the game, you can use them to fork your opponent's pieces and take one while he's still got to move out of check. The rooks are really useful for defense along the back line and castling, and also useful for attacking when you have a clear file to the other side. That's what they call the lines going from you to your opponent, are a file. And last but not least, control early with the pawns. Create a wall of pawns that you can get through, but your opponent cannot come towards you, towards your king. And in the end game, you want to really start trying to clear their path so that they can get to the other side and get promoted. So try and use those tips as you play this week with your family. And I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.